Okay, so continuing from where we left off, what we're going to do is we're going to turn off the visibility of the plane that's on these splines, and just turn off the spline wrap as well while we're at it. Because we're going to be using these splines for something else in a second. And I might as well turn off the plane that's on the floor as well. I'm reducing the number of things, so we're only really rendering what we need to. And so while we're at it, let's make sure we don't render the wine glass either right now, right? To do that, I clicked on the lower of the two gray circles here. So it's just off as well. It's still visible here, but right when I render this, all I get is this and the lights. Okay, so we've got things set up. So let's go ahead and we still have these two splines here, right? And so we're going to be using those in just a short minute. But first, we're going to introduce the cloner object. And so I'm going to go ahead and create a new scene just to make this a lot easier to see what's going on. So the cloner object is this object here that's got these green circles on the thing. I'm going to click on this. And when I do that, right, it displays something on the ground, but there's nothing inside of it. And what the cloner does is it clones objects. So let's go ahead and create a cube. And we're going to make this cube a child of the cloner. Now, what it appears to have done initially is to just make that cube larger. But the cloner is set so that each one of the clones is spaced 200 centimeters apart by default, and the cubes are 200 centimeters by 200 centimeters by 200 centimeters. So let's go ahead and make these 100 by 100 by 100. All right, and so you can see that I've created this grid now of clones. Right, there's it's a 3 by 3 grid of clones. And so if I click on the cloner object itself, you'll see that currently the mode is set to grid array. And if I come down, we're not going to worry about any of those options yet, or this instance mode. But what we're going to look at is we're going to see that we have this count, right? And the count is 3 by 1 by 3. If I make this middle one 3 as well, right, that means in the y direction and height, I'm going to have 3 clones. And so now I have this grid of 9 by, right, 3 by 3 by 3 cubes. Okay. So I can also increase this to something, arbitrarily large, right? So I have 25 clones and 25 clones, right? And now I have a huge, right, a huge number of clones of these objects. Okay. So I've got these, right? This is one of the ways I can set this. I'm going to make this smaller again. I'm going to go back. I'm going to go to 5 by 5 instead with a 3 deep. Okay. Or 3 tall. So I've got these set. And then there's this mode down here that's per step and size, right? So per step, I can also say endpoint. And this what this does is it sets the outer dimensions of the cloner object, and then it evenly spaces the clones between that, right? So if I do endpoint mode, you'll see I have these little dots all over the place, and I can click on those dots and I can, right, expand this, right? So in the X direction right now, right, I'm expanding it, and these are evenly spacing based on that expansion. If I go in this other direction, right, I can evenly space it this way. If I come up here to this orange one, I can evenly space this way. And then you'll notice I've got these corners as well, right? So I can actually expand from the corner of the object, right? So I have several ways in which I can adjust the dimensions of this cloner, right? And then you'll notice down below there is the form, and there's cubic, and then there's a fill. If I set this fill, if I just go ahead and actually scroll through this, right, you can see that I can either, if I go to 1% fill, I don't know why that's not working. Okay, so, right, so, I get basically, it doesn't work all that well, but I can kind of reduce the number of clones in here. If I keep going down, and eventually when I get to 0, I just have 1 clone. Right, so it doesn't, I've never really used the fill setting. It doesn't seem to work that great for me. But so there's this option for cubic, there's sphere, which granted, right, I don't see all of those cubes yet, but what's happening is there's essentially a spherical shape that's defining the outside boundaries of this. And so it just sort of cuts off any of the clones that don't fit within that. Right? If I made my cubes smaller, like if I say made them 25 by 25 by 25, I might be able to fit more inside a sphere. Right? So if I increase this number of things, you can see that I get like a denser, and if I go 8 this way, 8 or 9 this way, there we go. Right? I can get this like denser, and it's and these dimensions aren't very spherical either right now because of the way I've adjusted it. But right, so you can get this, you know, more of a spherical shape. I can also come down to cylinder, right? And if I rotate up, you'll see that, right, you can imagine that this is a cylinder where there's a circle at the end that's creating that shape. If I go to object, I can actually choose an object to make this shape. So I'm just going to go with a platonic, and I'm going to make that platonic, I'll just make it 1,000 centimeters in size. And then I'm going to say cloner, and I'm going to grab that object using that arrow, and then I can uncheck this object to make it invisible. And for some reason, I'm just getting one clone in there. Not exactly sure why. Let's do per step, and let's make our steps 10 by 10 by 10. Yeah, even that is not really working inside this platonic, so I don't know what's going on with that. Again, I typically don't use these in that way. I'm going to go ahead and do the endpoint mode again and pull this out so we actually have a grid of squares. Okay, so that's the grid array. One of the other options we have is linear, right, which basically creates a line of clones that I can extend, and in this case, right, it's in the y direction. You'll notice that I have these options here, right? So I have several options. One, it's per step or endpoint again, so I could always, right, use this endpoint. Now notice that I can also, this endpoint can be an x, y, and z. So I can use this to create more of like a stair step effect. If I zoom out here a little bit, right? So I don't need to just keep this in one direction, right? I can move this all over the place. Okay, so we can use endpoint to manipulate where these clones are drawn in space. Something else we can do is we can adjust the size of the clones, right? So I can increase the scale of the clones as they get further from the origin point, right? So, right, the origin point's down there, and now I've got this tower of clones that slowly grows in size. I can also adjust rotation, right? So you can see that in my different views, right, by rotating in H, P, and B, I can also, in linear mode, have all of my clones slightly rotate as they move along, right? This is a great way if you're trying to make, like, I don't know, DNA or something like that. You can create kind of a helix shape by using something like using the rotation values, because it starts at one point. It doesn't rotate them all. It rotates each one a certain number of degrees per step until you get to the final number of degrees. So if I made this 360 in one direction, right, you would see that they eventually rotate all the way around. I'm going to set these other two values to 0 so you can get a better sense of what's going on there, right? So you can see that this essentially looks like it's been rolling somewhere, but it's all the still images of that roll. So if I think P is the one that I really am interested in, and just do 0 for this, right? Then I can get this to eventually rotate all the way around in a complete circle. I can adjust the count again, right? I can have fewer or more. I can adjust the offset on this as well, so the clones don't have to start at the origin. They can actually be offset. This is something that people tend to use for animation purposes, where you want this to animate over time. If I do per step and I reduce this, right, again, I have these values are now set to how many degrees it rotates per step, how many units it moves in each direction per step, and what percent scale it goes up in each step. There's several step modes. Each one just is slightly different. And you can adjust those step sizes. It's best to just kind of play with each of these because you can kind of learn what it does. So we've got linear, right? We also have radial. So I'm going to go ahead and get in close to this, right? So I can create clones within a circle, right? I can increase the count. I can increase the radius. This is most like the array option. I can change my plane, right? So it's XY, XZ, ZY. I'm going to leave it in the XZ. I can adjust where these clones start on the circle and where they end, right? They can even overlap and continue beyond 0 or 360, right? So I could say, oh, I only want these clones, you know, in like a little less than half a circle. The offset, again, right, I can adjust where they're at on there. This is, again, offset is oftentimes used for animation. Offset variation, I can create some more variation between the spacing between the clones. And you'll see that when I do this offset, some other interesting things start to happen as I rotate this around. There's also the offset seed. So by adjusting that, I can sort of choose the random value that it starts with. And so the other thing that I can do with these, with the cloner that I cannot do with the array tool is I can have multiple objects in my cloner. So I've created a sphere now that's probably way too big. The cube is 25 centimeters, so I will make the radius on this 12.5, so they're about the same size. And then I'm just going to make the sphere a child of the cloner as well. And when I do that, you'll see that even in this like kind of messed up view here, I'm going to change my offset variation to 0. I'm going to adjust my offset to 0. And I'm going to go ahead and have my start angle be equal to 0 and end angle equal to 360. Right, so I can have multiple objects of children of this clone. And one of the things I can do with this is I can change the way this works. In iterate, it just goes through the order, and so it goes sphere, cube, sphere, cube, sphere, cube until it finishes. If I do random, it will randomly assort right, which clones go where. If I go to blend, basically what that does is it takes and does an even number of each of your two clones. And then sort, right, it basically, I'm not 100% sure why, but it just does the first clone. There's some other things that you can do when you have it set to sort, that you can use some different things to make it sort those clones, but we're not going to cover that right now. Right, and so I have two things. You could have 10 different objects in here. It doesn't really matter, and they can be anything. But we're going to go ahead and actually leave it as just spheres. So I'm going to change this back to iterate. I'm going to get rid of the cubes for now because we're going to use this. Now, radial, right, if I have an object that's round like the wine glass, I could use a radial cloner to essentially put these lumps around the outside edge of that wine glass, right? But if I wanted to do something up like one of the vertical, like from the base up the stem and up to the top of the glass, then I'm going to need something a little bit different in order to make this happen. And there's a couple other things we can do with cloners as well that we'll talk about in a little bit. But let's go ahead and see what happens when we look at some of these other objects, right? So some of the other options here are, we do have a honeycomb array as well, which basically creates a grid, but they're offset, right? So sort of like a honeycomb, which is why they call it that. And then there's the object array, or the object mode. And the object mode allows us to, we have this platonic, so let's go ahead and use that again. So the object mode allows us to select an object, like the platonic, and use that as our object for our clones. And so I have to zoom pretty far out. I might have to turn this on. There we go. Right? And so the object now has these little spheres all over it. Let's make our spheres a little bigger. Let's make 50 just because this thing is so big. Right? And so it's actually gluing these clones onto the surface of this object. Now, when I do that, there's several options that I have, right? I've got this, I can either align them, which doesn't really make sense. Here you can see in these outlines how they're all sort of aligned, and this changes that. So when I uncheck that, they're all pointed basically, they're up vector, right? They're all pointed up, the original orientation. Otherwise, they're aligned to the surface that they're on. If I say up vector is none, but I could do, right, x plus, I could say y plus, right? I can basically direct them all to point in a certain direction. Now, there's several different types of distribution. Surface distribution allows me to do a couple things. First, I can increase the count, right? So I can have more of these things on the surface of this object. And then my seed value basically allows me to set to where these are randomly generated on the surface of the object. Now, if I want these to be here, but I don't want the object to be there, right, I can always leave it live, but make it invisible both in the editor and in the render engine, right? So I just have this like clump of circles that look like they're kind of floating in space. And if I rotate this view a little bit, right, you'll see that they are essentially a shell of this object. There's space inside there. Okay. So the other types of things I can do is I can do a vertex, right? So essentially all of these, I don't have a choice as to how many clones I have. It's only it's based on the number of vertices on the object. So in this case, if I click on my platonic, I only have one segment, right? So each face only has 3 vertices, or however many vertices it is, that make up that icosahedron, right? If I change this to a dodecahedron, right, or a buckyball, which maybe I should turn this back on so you can kind of see the geometry, right? You can see that I have now these different sets of points. If I go back to a, what's the base? Not an octa, it's a icosa is the default. Right, if I go back to the icosahedron and I increase my number of segments, right, suddenly I have more of these clones on the ball, right? And if I increase to 3, I get a lot more, 4, 5, etc., right? And I could basically keep increasing this number until they overwhelm the entire surface of the object. Similarly, if I change my object, like if I was to go ahead and let's just create a sphere. And now I'm going to go ahead and go to my cloner and change my object here from my platonic to my sphere. And I make that sphere a little bit bigger. Let's make this radius 500. There we go. And let's hide this. Right, so now you can see, right, I've got one for all of those vertices. If I change the type of layout, you will see that I also get right, differing amounts of points based on these vertices, right? And if I was to make this sphere smaller, like let's make them 10. Actually, let's make them 15 centimeters in diameter, right? But then if I was to go to my sphere and increase this number of segments to say 36, right, I'm going to get a much larger sphere of points. Okay, so I've got these options as ways to align things, right? And that's really going to depend on the geometry of my objects as far as how those lay out. And I don't really have the option to only do a portion of that when I'm doing this on a primitive. But if I do this selection, what I can do is let's go ahead and make our big sphere editable. And then I'm going to go to polygons mode, and I'm going to use my live selection tool, and I'm just going to kind of select a blob out of here, just sort of randomly. And then I'm going to go up to select at the top of the menu, top menu here. I'm going to go to set selection. So now I have this polygon selection area. And so now I should be able to go to my cloner, and I should be able to grab this selection thing and drag it down here and drop it into this polygon selection. And now my clones are only going to be on the area that I had selected, right? So this allows me a little bit more control over where all of these clones will be, right? And if I check mark enable scaling, right, I can also essentially randomize some of the scale on this option. Okay. All right, so this allows me to have some of these be, you know, significantly smaller and significantly larger. It gives me just a little bit more variation. Okay, so for the last little example here, what we're going to do is we're going to go to one of our side views. Let's go to our front view, zoom out enough so you have some space over here, and then I want you to grab the sketch tool under the spline tools and just sort of scribble. Right? Okay, so I've scribbled out this spline, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and select my cloner again, and I'm going to change my object from the sphere to this spline that I just created. And you will see that now I have some points that have been applied across this thing. And you'll see that with a spline selected, I have changes here, right? And there's different types of distribution. I can either do it by count, step, even, vertex, or axis, right? So if I do vertex, that's basically every point that's on this line now has a vertex. If I do count, right, currently the count is 10, right? I can increase that count to whatever I want. Notice that they tend to clump around hard corners because there are more points in there. And so what it's doing is it's trying to evenly distribute this out between across the segments between the different points. And so I can uncheck per segment here, and I thought it was going to smooth that out a little bit, but maybe not. So if I uncheck, let's leave it per segment. I have the count set to 69. If I go to my spline, right, one of the things that's going on right now is this is set to adaptive. If I make this uniform, that's going to evenly space all of these spheres along this spline, right? So, so uniform is a really good option for this. Natural is a little bit less smushed together. Subdivided, again, would be another one that works pretty well while maintaining the shape, right? So either subdivided or uniform is going to give you the best spacing for your clones using the count method. And so if I do step, right, then you just set the step, the number of centimeters, right? And so if I increase this number, I'll have fewer spheres. If I decrease this number, I'm going to have, right, significantly more spheres that get populated along the spline. Smooth rotation, in this case, because they're spheres, it doesn't really matter. Again, now there's offset, so I can adjust the offset, which again would be great for animation. Offset variation, and if I increase this offset, right, I can intentionally get them to clump in groups if I want to. I'm going to go ahead and pull those both back down. Start and end. So start and end, right? I can adjust the start point of this. I can adjust the end point of this, which again is just essentially going to limit the number of splines. One of the things that's going on right now is that loop is turned on, right? So loop, they're essentially going off one end and coming on the other end. So if I now adjust these things right here, you can see that I can get this set. Okay. And if I change from step to even, then it basically is going to give me an even number of splines based on my count. And that will allow me to, again, shrink or grow this, right? Each thing gives us something a little bit different. And then the rate and rate variation, we don't really need to worry about right now, because that's something that isn't working with this. We talked about vertex axis. You know, it's basically just putting one clone there. I'm not sure what the use of that one is. There's probably a reason that I'm unaware of at this point. So this is how we can get clones along a spline. So let's go ahead and see this in the real world. So let's go back to our other scene. Oh, and by the way, if you hit the letter V on the keyboard, it pops up this nice little wheel of tools, one of which is the bottom one, allows you to select between your open projects. Extensions we don't really have any of. This allows you to turn on your snapping. These are all your selection tools. These are your modes, right? Recent tools that you can use here, and your view so you can adjust things. So if that seems helpful, the letter V is how you get to that. So I'm going to go back to this label start. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and select the rail spline. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy and paste that. And I'm going to pull it back down into the cube. And I'm just going to call this cloner spline. And now with this cloner spline, I'm going to go ahead and move this up so it's like above where the label would be. And with my cloner spline, I'm going to go ahead and create a cloner. I'm going to create, you can create any shape object that you want at this point. I'm going to go ahead and do, I don't know, I want to do platonics, why not? And obviously this platonic is huge, way too big. So I'm going to make it like 2 centimeters, and that's even bigger than I'd like. I'm going to make it 1 centimeter. And now that I've got this 1 centimeter clone, I'm going to drop it as a child of the cloner. And then with my cloner selected, I'm going to go ahead and change from grid array to object. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select my cloner spline. And you can see that I've already got these objects displayed around the edge of the spline. Now, right, I don't have them very evenly spaced right now, so I'm going to go ahead and switch to even and see if that does it. So this does it, and the reason I'm doing this rather than going up to my cloner spline and adjusting these intermediary points is because that's going to change the shape of these corners, and that's not something I'm super excited about doing, right? The other thing that we could do is we could also, you know, we can increase this count, but we could also say vertex, right? So it's these are only on the vertices. I'm not really interested in that. That doesn't look so great. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it at count, or sorry, at even. And then I'm just going to increase my clones until they're more or less in places I'm happy with. Let's say I'm happy with 14 clones in this case. I'm also going to shrink the size of these platonics down some. They're pretty big still, so I'm going to say, you know, maybe 0.5 centimeters. There we go. That looks like something that would be more like a feature on this object. And so now I've got all of these little clones that are, you know, halfway embedded, more or less halfway embedded into the glass. And I would like to make these all glass as well. And so I can either apply the glass material to the platonic itself or to the cloner, right? And either way, I'm going to get that material applied. And so now I'm going to go ahead and just render this to see what that looks like. Right? And so it's going to take some time, and maybe what I should have done is just rendered a section. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's render a region. Oh, let's hit escape. Let's just render this section right there so we can kind of see those. Right? So now I've got these things, and because of the way glass materials work, since this is intersecting with this other glass material, and they're both the same glass material, they have the same index of refraction, it basically treats it as though it's one object. Right, so I can't see any of the back side of these shapes because they're embedded in this other object. Right, I could, if I really wanted to make sure it was physically accurate, I could go through and bool these on there. But right, so now I have these uniform details that I've created using a cloner to apply them along this spline. Let's go ahead and do an example on the wine glass as well. So I'm going to make sure the wine glass is visible in both settings, and I'm going to go ahead and rotate my view some. I'm going to change my layout to model, and I'm going to go to edges mode. I'm going to go to loop selection, and I'm just going to choose one of these vertical things. Now, I'm going to let these wrap all the way around because, you know, who cares at this point? But so I've selected that loop, and now I'm going to go back up to spline. I'm going to go down to conversion, edge to spline, and I'm just going to use the same cloner and just switch objects because it's already there. And so I'm going to go ahead and say cloner, and I'm going to change it from cloner spline to this wine glass spline, right? And as soon as I do that, right, these things are starting to clump on here. And instead of having those platonics at that stage, right, let's go ahead, this says even. Let's go ahead and do step and shrink our step way down. Whoa, that's way too far down. Let's do a step of 2 centimeters. Let's do a step of 3 centimeters. Okay, so we'll pretend that this, for whatever reason, this is the horrible thing that we want to do to our wine glass, right? Now, we've done this on one spline, and you might think, oh, well then I need to clone this, or do the, like if I wanted these to be all the way around, I might need to clone, do the same thing over and over and over again, but I don't. What I do is I create a second cloner. I make the first cloner a child of the second cloner. And with this first cloner, instead of doing a grid array, I do a radial. And I make my radius smaller than 50. I make it like, let's just start it at 5. Right? And so you can see that things are offset a little bit right now, but we'll get there. So, and let's up the count, and let's make our radius 1. Right? And you'll see that things are not quite where they should be. Right? We've got these things floating in space. They're all kind of partially rotated in the wrong direction. One of them's in the right place, but everything else is not. And so, right, so all of these splines are, let me get rid of that. All of these splines are totally offset right now, right? They're not where I want them to be. And part of that is because of the position of the wine glass. So I'm going to temporarily hide the cube, so I can't see that at all because it's going to get in the way. I'm going to select the wine glass, and you'll see that the Z direction is 18 centimeters. I'm going to set that to 0. I'm going to hit apply down here. And as soon as I do that, my clones align on the surface all the way around this object. Now, I have the number of clones currently set to, in the radial cloner, currently set to 8. All right, if I do any more, the stem is going to be totally packed full of clones because of how big these are. But one thing I could do, like let's say I just wanted this to be on this surface here, right? I could potentially, because this is such an even grid, I could have these set to actually have the wine glass be the cloner, have the clones on them, and set it that way. So let's go ahead and take a look at that, right? Because this is going to be a little bit more of a mess to deal with. I could also adjust, I could also adjust where these are on the cloner based with offset start and end, right? So I have this distribution set to step, and if I adjust my starting position, I don't know which way these go. Oh, and I turn off loop. There we go. I adjust my starting position. Right, okay, so this is bringing all of them down lower. Let's go ahead and go up a little bit. Let's pull the end position. I'm not quite sure what's going on here. I think what's happening is because this spline goes on the inside and outside of the glass, they're getting distributed everywhere, right? Now I could just render a section of this real quick just so we can at least see what this looks like. All right, but so I do have these clones embedded in the glass. Let's go ahead and try having the wine glass be the object that the cloner is using. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this cloner out of that radial cloner, because all I'm going to need is one set. And instead of having this wine glass spine, let's just go ahead and select our wine glass. Right? And when I do that, by default, these are sort of randomly placed on the outside. Now, if I was trying to do, say, condensation on a glass, this would be a great way to make little bubbles of condensation. But that's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do is make these look like they're uniform objects. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to vertex. Right? And now, wow, that thing looks amazing, right? Because there's so many vertices on this object, especially around that top rim, you know, I've got some issues. And so what I could do is I could select my wine glass itself, and I could temporarily turn the cloner off so I can see what I'm doing. I can go to polygons mode, and I can just maybe do selections of polygons. And I'm just going to use loop selection. I'm going to click off, and I'm just going to do a few of these loops around the outside, just basically every other set of polygons, right? So I don't have quite so many clones, and I'll go up to this top edge too, right? But I don't want any of the top, and I don't want the inside. I just want these outside ones. So now I've made this selection, and again, I can go to set selection down here at the bottom, or I can go up to select and go down to set selection here. And once I've set that polygon selection, then I can come back to my cloner, and I can click on this polygon selection and drag it down here, and then turn my cloner back on, right? And so now all of those clones are only being applied to vertices in the loops that I've selected. Now, because these things are so big, they're actually going through on the inside of the cup as well. And so I could always either make these smaller. I'm going to make them 0.25 in size. There we go. And those might still poke through because this is such a thin-walled material. But so now I can go ahead and let's render a little bit of this and just see what we get. All right, so this is another way that we can add detail to this surface. Now, we could also potentially use this with a, right, this is actually it looks pretty great. I mean, I don't know if I'd want to drink out of a glass like this, but it looks, you know, it looks pretty great. Okay, so I'm not going to let this render all the way through. You can if you would like to. But so these are ways that we can use cloners and use some of the tools that we've been using to apply a bunch of detail to the surface of an object, so we don't have to individually place these objects along that surface. Right? This allows us to do pretty complex stuff with reasonable ease. Okay, so now let's say that we want to apply, right, I'm going to get rid of all of this in the next section, but let's say that we want to apply either a plane to this surface, like a sticker or like a label that would go on a wine glass, or, right, I don't know why you'd have a Crown Royal label on a wine glass, but, you know, to each their own. Or let's say that you needed to have, like, say, cylinders of glass that, you know, maybe there were ribs on here that came up, or other shapes that were uniformly cut into this rounded surface or applied to this rounded surface. And so, and that's one place where the cloner wouldn't necessarily work, because you would have your, you wouldn't be able to have those objects round. If I had a bunch of cylinders in here, they would potentially touch, but they would all have hard edges as they went around this curve. And so we'll look at some other ways to apply things cleanly to the surface of an object.